now we see that after more than a week of protests, people's frustration is really clear in their chants where they say death to the dictator, down with the Islamic Republic. There are even some calls for the return of the monarchy. It's a wholesale rejection of the system that's currently in place.
One of the things that has annoyed Donald Trump about Venezuela is that it sends its oil to Iran, breaking American sanctions. Iran itself is in some trouble. Protests have been raging there for more than a week, and now the Times has seen an intelligence report that Ayatollah Khamenei could flee to Russia if the protests escalate. Gissou Nia is a senior fellow of the Atlantic Council and board member of the Iran Human Rights Documentation Centre. She's been following the protests and was instrumental in drawing up legal sanctions against Iran for violence against women in the 2022 protests. Good morning.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us. For people who have maybe not followed this as closely as you do, what is the situation on the ground in Iran right now? I mean, how widespread are the protests?
Yeah, we're in the 8th day of protests. Today will be the 9th if it continues. And at least 19 protesters have been reported to have been killed. Harana, which is an Iran human rights group that does a lot of good documentation work on the ground, has said that there are demonstrations in Iran that have spread to at least 222 locations nationwide, with rallies reported in 78 cities across 26 provinces. So it's very widespread. And these are the biggest protests since the protests that you mentioned for woman life freedom in 2022. And the slogans are very anti-regime in nature.
And what is it that's motivating people specifically? I mean, obviously the regime more broadly is behind a lot of what people are frustrated about, but is it economic? Is it human rights? Is it the way that people are forced to live their lives? What's been the catalyst for these specific protests?
So for these specific protests, it was really a free fall in the currency in Iran. So Iran's rial has lost more than half its value since September, and food prices, in comparison to the same time last year, have risen by 72% or somewhere around there. And so this is very difficult for people to be able to feed their families, to even buy bread. It's not even a conversation around the more luxury items, right? It's around basic necessities. And so that's what really brought people out onto the street initially. But now we see that after more than a week of protests, people's frustration is really clear in their chants where they say death to the dictator, down with the Islamic Republic. There are even some calls for the return of the monarchy. It's a wholesale rejection of the system that's currently in place.
And what's been the response from the regime? I mean, you mentioned there 19 protesters have been killed so far after 8 days of protest, but how weak is the regime? I mean, what do you think its response is going to be in the coming days?
Well, the regime has been significantly weakened over the past year after the 12-day war with Israel. I should note that almost 1/3 of the perpetrators at the national level who enacted violence against the woman life freedom protesters, so that's senior officials from the military, the intelligence, the police, almost 1/3 of them have been killed by Israel. So the regime is in a very weakened position. The president of the Islamic Republic, Pezeshkian, he talked about having a dialogue with the protesters. They've been trying to figure out how to crank out subsidies or do things that will give some economic relief. But I think that the threats from President Donald Trump, also following off the heels of the actions of the US government in Venezuela and capturing the dictator there, Nicolas Maduro, probably has sent sort of a warning shot, I would say, to the Islamic Republic, and they'll probably be choosing their next steps quite wisely.
I mean, could they be removed? I mean, you mentioned the Trump threat. I mean, obviously people are looking at that now, as you say, in a different way after what's happened in Venezuela. But is it possible, do you think, that the regime could be removed, could topple completely?
It's really unclear to say. I think the thing that we mainly know about President Trump's foreign policy is that it's very unpredictable. What I will say is that there has been a long-standing internal movement for change inside Iran. This is just the latest in successive protests that have been happening since June 2009, when there was a disputed presidential election that a lot of the country believed was stolen. And since 2017, there's been protests every few years, and they've become broader and encompassing different parts of the socioeconomic classes. And so I think that change might be near, and there is widespread dissatisfaction with the regime, as well as broad civil disobedience to some of the laws that are on the books.
Gissou Nia, really fascinating to get your thoughts on that. Thank you so much for taking us through what's happening in Iran. That is Gissou Nia there, the Senior Fellow of the Atlantic Council.
What's so interesting is the first step in all of this, you can easily give yourself a moral persuasion that it's the right thing to do. Maduro is a good example. Terrible dictator, driven Venezuela into the ground, not democratically elected, get rid of him. Iran, terrible regime, get rid of it. But this is where the people who warn against intervention always say, that's understandable. It's what happens on day 2 to 100 or year 2 to 5 follows next. And the argument about Donald Trump is he's not a long-term planner. He's quite an of-the-moment contingent figure, isn't he? And so he could see Maduro is a bad guy. I want to increase my sphere of influence. I'll go after him. What happens on day 2, day 10, day 100 is a slightly trickier thing to get into. And
what's the American intention? Because that phrase, spheres of influence, I think we're going to hear that in the next week or so, way more than we've ever heard it in the weeks previous. And maybe that's partly our problem, because America was very clear in its recent security strategy about the fact that it wants to shift its gaze away from Europe and from Asia to a certain extent to what it sees as its sphere of influence. And this is something Trump said in his first presidency, that South America, the Americas more generally, is where Trump believes he has agency and license, which doesn't require him to go to the UN, which doesn't even in this instance require him to go to Congress, because this is where America is allowed to use its power because it affects America directly. And the argument that is being made now by those close to Trump is that Venezuela is about domestic security. It's about economic security, but it's also about domestic security in terms of drugs and illegal immigration. And this is just an extension of American domestic policy, and therefore we shouldn't view it as regime change. Now, that's where the question of international law comes in. But if this is what Trump is doing, shifting to a sphere of influence, and therefore basically tacitly agreeing to China and Russia doing the same, what does that mean for Ukraine? And what does it mean for Taiwan? And would there have been any difference made if Trump hadn't
and what does it mean for Europe, which has no skin in the game at all? Of course, Trump then blurs the lines further, because he says, and you might mention regime change, and it is regime change. So even when his people around him are saying it's not regime change,
not. He's like,
it actually is. It's quite a confusing picture in some respects, but it feels like the sands are shifting, and we're going to try and understand them as well as we